All right. Let's get the ball rolling on this one. Hello, everyone. This is Dwight Woods, the Jeet Kune Rebel. Welcome to the I Love Jeet Kune broadcast number 46. This is the one about is Filipino Kali part of the JKD curriculum? And as you're logging in, you guys know the drill. Be kind enough to say where you're logging in from. Hit the like button. Feel free to continue hitting the like button and what have you. As you might know, the origin story, right? So a lot of times I'll take a question on Quora and use aspects of it, or even turn it into the broadcast topic. And so I did that with this question: is Filipino Kali part of the JKD curriculum? Well, as we say down in the islands, who tell me do that, right? Because you could say in response that it depends on what you mean by part and also what you mean by curriculum. So, for example, if you take a look at this, I've shown you guys this before, page 41 of Fighting Arts from way back in March of 1976. Right, then you could say that you have your answer, because right here it says Filipino stick fighting part of JKD curriculum, right? So you could end the discussion right there and say, oh yeah, there's the answer. But we don't necessarily know the context, right, of that. We don't know if it was Inosano himself who was responsible for that being written, or it could have been the writer of the article or the typesetter or whatever. But instantly, as soon as we mention Kali and JKD in the same sentence, what happens? You're undoubtedly talking about Dan Inosano, and somebody is going to consider it what do you call it? An attack on Dan Inosano, and so somebody's gonna rush to his defense or what have you, right? And there are some people. Hey, Victor. Hi, Miguel. There are some people who consider Inosano the Pope of Jeet Kune, and then there are some who consider him the Benedict Arnold of Jeet Kune, right? In any case, when you listen to the people from the era of Dan Inosano's backyard, I would say, you hear them say, and maybe even the early days of the Kali Academy, right? You'll hear them say that after the JKD class, then there was like 30 minutes of the stick work, let's call it, right? And anybody who was attracted to the stick work, they stayed around and trained in that, and then those who weren't would leave. So to me, that sounds like there was, at that time, at least at that time, a very separate distinction between the two, right? But I know that in putting this question up, that I opened up the proverbial can of worms, right? Because there are several opinions that are proffered. Some are agreeing, some are disagreeing, some are complimentary, some are conciliatory, others not so much, right? And of course, this is what I call a cross-talk topic with something like, is Jeet Kune a style or a system, right? My senior, Del Pollard, Del confirmed the separation between the JKD class and the Kali session, and Del is a guy who dates back to the old days. Neil McLeod brought up an interesting idea, right? That if Bruce Lee was an open-minded martial artist and his research partner, Dan Inosano, is a guy who is well-versed in the Filipino arts, then it might be silly to think that Bruce Lee would not have had any experience of it or would not have taken something from it. And Neil drew a correlation between Kali's presence and JKD's presence. Kali's presence and fencing's presence in JKD. And Del responded that even though the fencing is not part of the Jeet Kune curriculum, right, in that we don't train actual fencing, well, I should say some of us don't, because last week my Jeet Kune Dialogues partner, Jeff Westfall, he actually trains or did train in fencing, and I think there's actually a fencing within his school. There's a fencing academy, right? So anyhow, so Del was saying that even though fencing is not part of the curriculum, right, that there are still concepts of fencing in JKD, right? And then that made me think. The name Jeet Kune actually comes from the way of the stopping whatever, right? The stop hit comes from from fencing. And Kali, Eskrima, Arnis. Eskrima is a Spanish word that comes from the Latin escrimare, which means to fence, right? To fight with a sword. So I don't know, man. That's I think that's kind of interesting, right? Okay, so anyhow, so then Guy Chase, my senior up in Massachusetts, chimed in on that. One of the reasons why the two arts are so closely connected is that on seminar, right, the similarities were very, very often highlighted. The instructor might show a JKD technique, and then 2 minutes later he might show a Kali technique, right? And so or you start the drill with a technique from one and finish with a technique from the other. So on the seminar circuit, the two were inextricable. Hotman Canela submitted that there's a common thread between the two arts, and that is certainly backed up by what we read on it's page 153. Hang on a second, right? I had planned to get to this later, but I think I got it here. It's page 153 of the Art and Philosophy book, right? Where it says Richard Bustillo, the late Richard Bustillo, Jeet Kune legend, points out some of the basic similarities between the two, right? Both arts stress the lead hand and the lead foot. Whether it's the left or the right, the front hand is the live hand, the parry or sliding hand. In Eskrima, it's the same thing. He says in JKD, we use the term trapping. In Eskrima, they say checking, right? So, yeah, so there's that, right? Then, David Cheng, my good friend David Cheng, reminded us that the late Ted Lukai, Ted Lukai called his approach Kali JKD, which I remember. I mean, anybody who has seen Guru Ted's, and I just did it right there. He referred to himself as Guru Ted as opposed to Sifu Ted or what have you, right? And I believe that referring to it as Kali JKD was ultimately his way of saying that for him, he had so blended the two that they were no longer separate, let's say, in his mind and in his heart and in his practice, right? What I really, really liked was what Rob Lee had to say. And Rob gave me an image that is now indelible in my mind, right? Rob said that for him, it's one of those circle without a circumference answers, right? So that the circumference is the limit of the circle, right? So that outer edge is the limit of the circle. However, a circle without circumference still has a center. And so the center of the circle without circumference is that material that Cedro Bruce taught and that has been handed down. But because that is the center of a circle without circumference, then we have room to grow, to include ideas that allow for better adaptation, which I thought was really interesting, the way that Rob expressed that, right? So Kali is not the center, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not the center. Muay Thai is not the center. Pencak Silat is not the center, right? But experimenting with these systems might inform a JKD practitioner's growth outward from the center to better adapt, right? Which I thought was that was pretty cool, right? You want to read more about the center of circumference stuff? Page 200 of the page 200 of the Tao Jeet Kune. You can find it there. Then similar to what Rob expressed, Kent Nelson said essentially the same thing, in that Jun Fan is always the foundational structure, but the personal experimentation on top of that structure is what graduated it to Jeet Kune. So he says, therefore, it seems that as long as there is a Jun Fan base plus personal experimentation in other arts, like Kali, then that's what equals Jeet Kune. So then it would stand to reason that Filipino martial arts may or may not be found in somebody's Jeet Kune curriculum, but it depends on the person and that person's journey, right? So to say that there's no Filipino martial arts in Jeet Kune is to take away the individual aspect of the art, and that individual aspect is perhaps the most crucial JKD element of all, right? And I think what Rob said and what Kent said is actually a perfect example of JKD's inherent individualism, because they were saying essentially the same thing, that Jun Fan martial arts, right, Jun Fan kickboxing, kung fu, that is your foundational structure, that is your fundamental, right? Ray Crow, who's been around like Dell since the 1970s, says that you could always choose your area of study at the Kali Academy, right? Kevin Seaman said that there are two different approaches, even though he often finds elements of JKD in Kali, but not so much the other way around, right? And we'll find out exactly what he means, because I plan to bring him back on the Jeet Kune dialogues pretty soon, right? That leads me back to what I remember. I referred to Ted Lukai as Guru Ted, right? Which was something that I always heard him say that. And I noticed that, and Rick Fay and I spoke about this, that a lot of people today refer to Dan Inosanto as Guru Dan, right? And that's not something that I personally remember from 30 years ago when I first started with him. I could be wrong, but I don't remember it. I have always called him Sifu Inosanto. And Rick said that it is it's because of the era in which you come in, so that the people who come from what we could call the Jun Fan era might use the term Sifu, as opposed to people who came in the, let's call it the Kali era, and then they might be more inclined to use the term Guru. But for me, Dan Inosanto is my Sifu, not my Guru, so you probably won't hear me use that term. In any case, another thing that I remembered, and Rick and I talked about this a little bit, in 1983, my first week was with Sifu Inosanto, and it was not for a Jeet Kune session. The session was pretty clearly entitled Filipino Kali, right? But I wanted to meet and train with Dan Inosanto, the legend. My second week I spent with Francis Fong in Wing Chun. And I remember a conversation I had with Lun Sin, who was Sifu Francis's Wing Chun assistant at the time. And here's what Lun was saying. Lun went like this, right? And said that the triangle is his life, right? As a Wing Chun fanatic, right? The triangle, it was his life. And I remember thinking that with everything I had been introduced to in the previous week in the Kali class with Dan Inosanto and Cass Magda, Cass as Sifu Dan's assistant, I could very easily hear Cass also saying that the triangle, but out of Filipino Kali, was his life also. So I thought that was that was kind of interesting, right? And so it goes back to what I read to you from the Art and Philosophy book, right? About the similarities. You know, like another thing that I make. I mean, this doesn't prove anything, but in Wing Chun they have the double sword, right? And in Kali they have the double stick. And just last night we were playing around with the balisong, which is called the butterfly knife, right? And in Wing Chun, they call it the butterfly sword or the butterfly knife also, right? I find it interesting that when you make this position in the Wing Chun, it's called the wing block. And when you hold the stick and you block like this, which is pretty much the same arm position, it's also called a wing block. It doesn't prove anything. I just think it's a happy coincidence, right? Then there's the Del said something interesting also, which and it was something that Mark Stewart had commented on to me, because that's where I first heard the term latter stage Jeet Kune, which I believe refers to what Bruce Lee was doing and the way he was moving and towards the end, his unfortunate passing. And that latter stage JKD was all pretty much fencing and boxing or fencing or kickboxing or something, right? So it illustrates again that fencing was of major importance, but that Eskrima is a name for fencing, right? Tim Becker talked about the influence of Filipino boxing in the U.S., right? Which is something that I have heard about, but I have not. I mean, Tim's at the Inosano Academy, so Tim's got much better source material than I do, right? But he was talking about the influence of Filipino martial art on United States boxing, and so it's quite possible that a lot of the stuff that, although I didn't see this for myself, because in the Tao Jeet Kune, Bruce Lee's notes are taken from, I think, a Jack Dempsey book, and also from definitely from Edward Hazlett's book, right? But I'm not sure if Dempsey and Hazlett had anything to do with Filipino boxing, right? Then another thing. So this was another thing I wanted to put out there. We know that the concept of yin yang was of extreme importance to Bruce Lee. Harinder Singh, Sifu Harinder Singh, talked about the fact that the Jeet Kune Do logo is actually a Tai Chi logo, right? A yin yang logo. And I remember hearing Sifu Dan but just kind of make a parallel observation that Wing Chun kind of preserves center line and forces you to come around. And so when you come around, because they hold center line, then they just come straight down the center, right? As opposed to Kali, which might open up center line and draw you to come to them on the straight line, and then they'll attack you on an angle, right, off the straight line. So you have, by training in both of them, then what you have is that blend of the yin yang, right? But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be, we'll call it problems, right? We'll get problems with how should I put this? Let's call it too much Kali in your JKD, right? So Mark Stewart said the emphasis on compound trapping, for example, right? And there was a time, or maybe even for some people, compound trapping is still a signature, as Mark said, a signature of JKD training. And that is similar to Kali's double stick drills, right? So Mark's direct quote is, cognitive coordination training is only a facet, not a signature, right? And Del agreed with that and said it's about training the neuromuscular pathways, right? Now, I'm not as talented as Mark and Del, but I think what they're talking about is that you could get lost in the complexities of the variations in something like Kali double stick. And, some people might get caught up in adding pattern after pattern and variation after variation, and then that takes them down a path or in a direction where they end up becoming crammed and distorted, to use a Bruce Lee term, crammed and distorted by a mess of their own creation, right? Another aspect is, and this came out of watching an interview of Sifu Dan's, and he was talking about Bruce Lee's desire to promote his culture, his Chinese culture, right? And so I can see where Dan Inosanto, I mean, it's pretty much said in the Art and Philosophy book, that he had a similar thought, right? I can promote the Filipino culture, and at the same time, we can have an outlet for all of us who want to continue to follow the path that Bruce Lee had blazed in martial art. So we could have the Kali Academy and promote Filipino culture, but then we still have this separate JKD environment, the separate JKD class, right, which is open up to select individuals. That is, can be sometimes tricky, because there are some people who would say that in Bruce Lee's evolution, he looked at other arts, and so it's probable that he would have continued to do that, right? And at the same time, it's tricky, because I'll point out for the third time that at the time of his passing, Bruce Lee was pretty much all about fencing and boxing, right? Anyhow, it was an interesting question. A lot of people jumped in and contributed, and we all had a good time with it. I sometimes, because some people can take this whole Jeet Kune thing really, really seriously. I mean, and I do too, because I'm a professional Jeet Kune instructor. But sometimes I try to make the joke that, actually I have two jokes for you, right? So one of the jokes that I try to make is that there were two great experiments conducted in the United States, right? The first one being the 1787 Constitutional Convention, and where it's reported that when Benjamin Franklin exited, he was asked, what kind of government did you vote on? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. So that was the first great experiment in the United States, right? The second great experiment was Bruce Lee's creation of Jeet Kune in 66 to 67 as an art, science, and philosophy, if it can remain so. That's my humor. Okay, so that's it for today. Guys, feel free to share, like, comment, ask questions. I'll review everything before posting, after posting. Sign up for notifications for when we go live on Facebook, and also the new YouTube channels for both the I Love Jeet Kune broadcast and the I Love Jeet Kune and the Jeet Kune dialogues. And coming soon, the JKD Rebels store, online store. Quick heads up, Friday, October 5th. So let's see. There'll be 2 episodes of the Jeet Kune dialogues. The first one at 3 p.m. Miami time is with Tanya Subing Monroe. And then a few hours later at 6 p.m., I'll be back with Diana Lee Inosanto. So we have a Ladies of Jeet Kune doubleheader this Friday, 3 p.m., 6 p.m., Tanya Subing Monroe, and then Diana Lee Inosanto, right? Okay, so here's the second joke, right? So a guy heard it said by scientists that milk gives strength. So he drank 4 glasses of milk, but he still couldn't move a wall. But when he drank 4 glasses of rum, he saw the wall moving all by itself. So his conclusion is that scientists are damn liars. Okay, that's it. I'll see you guys back here, some of you on Friday, and some of you next Wednesday for another episode of the I Love Jeet Kune broadcast. This is Dwight Woods, the Jeet Kune Rebel, signing off. You guys enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.